The cycle of the consumed. The city stretched endlessly below, a maze of glass and steel that reflected the pale, muted light of the overcast sky. Ethan Cole sat hunched at his desk on the 135th floor of a nameless, faceless skyscraper, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen before him. Rows of numbers and columns of data flickered, demanding his attention. He had been staring at them for hours, though they hardly registered anymore. Just endless figures with no meaning, no value beyond the monotonous task of piecing them together. It was late, far too late to still be here. His colleagues had all gone home hours ago, their workspaces dark, chairs neatly pushed under their desks. But Ethan remained. The senior reporting engineer always remained, long after everyone else had left. His only company, the cold, buzzing hum of fluorescent lights and the sterile, lifeless walls of the office. He hated his job. No, loathed it. He hated the long hours, the bland corporate meetings, the endless cycles of reports, all of it suffocating him slowly, like being trapped inside a glass coffin. Day after day, night after night, the same routine. He would rise before dawn, shuffle through the same crowded subway, ascend to the same desolate office, and sit in front of his computer until his mind was numb. Outside of work, there was nothing waiting for him. No family, no friends, no pets to come home to. Just the small, barren apartment with its single flickering lamp and a fridge half filled with forgotten takeout containers. Ethan hadn't bothered decorating, hadn't bothered with much of anything at all. Every part of his life was a reflection of the emptiness he felt inside, a slow and relentless erosion of his soul. The clock on his screen blinked 11:30 p.m. Another late night, another set of reports to finish. He sighed, rubbing his eyes, the fluorescent lights above flickering momentarily before resuming their ceaseless, cold glow. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the oppressive ceiling, and felt the weight of his existence pressing down on him. And then it came, a feeling. It started small, like a faint tremor in the pit of his stomach, an unease that wormed its way through his mind. Something was wrong. He sat up, glancing around the empty office. It looked the same as it had for years. Gray cubicles, neat rows of computers, the dim blue glow of his monitor. Yet, there was something in the air, something thick and heavy that hadn't been there moments before. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The silence was too perfect, the air too still. The hum of the lights seemed distant, swallowed by the growing weight of the room. He stood, his heart beginning to race, and walked toward the large glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the city. When his eyes met the skyline, his breath caught in his throat. The city he had known, the sprawling metropolis of high-rise buildings and gridlocked streets, was gone. In its place was a twisted, impossible landscape of writhing metal and distorted architecture, like some grotesque living organism that had consumed the familiar world. Skyscrapers bent at unnatural angles, their spires curling inward as if trying to devour themselves. Streets that had once been straight now wound in chaotic spirals, looping endlessly into the horizon. The sky above was a sickly bruise of purples and greens, crackling with strange flickering lights, and the creatures. They moved in the shadows of the deformed buildings, writhing, crawling things with too many limbs and too many eyes. One, hunched and massive, lumbered through the streets, its back covered in jagged spines that gleamed like black glass. Its head was a grotesque mass of mouths, each one snapping and gnashing, searching for something to devour. Another, serpentine and sinuous, slithered between the warped structures, its long, segmented body twisting and undulating as it fed on the broken remains of smaller creatures. Ethan's stomach churned as he watched the abominations devour each other, limbs and bodies torn apart in a frenzy of gore. The air itself seemed thick with rot, with the stench of blood and decay rising from the writhing mass below. He could hear the sickening sounds of flesh tearing, the wet crunch of bones snapping under monstrous jaws. The city he had known was gone, replaced by this nightmare of consumption and chaos. He stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced to make sense of what he had seen, but no answer came. The world had shifted and nothing was right. He needed to leave, needed to get out of this place before... A shadow fell across him. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat as he turned slowly. Standing in the dim light of the office, just beyond the reach of the flickering fluorescent bulbs, was a figure. Tall and thin, its silhouette was unmistakably human, but wrong, horribly wrong. Antlers, gnarled and twisted like the branches of a dead tree, jutted from its head, casting long shadows across the floor. Its eyes, bright, glowing white, pierced through the darkness, locking onto Ethan with an intensity that felt like a physical force. It stood motionless, watching him. For a long moment, neither moved. Ethan felt his skin crawl, his muscles tense, as though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But fear kept him rooted to the spot, staring into those terrible white eyes. Then, the figure took a step forward. Ethan's paralysis broke. He bolted, sprinting toward the stairwell door at the far end of the office. His feet pounded against the carpeted floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold metal of the door handle bit into his palm as he yanked it open and hurled himself into the stairwell. He didn't stop to think. He just ran. The narrow stairwell was a twisting, echoing chamber that spiraled down into darkness. He had 135 flights to descend, and the thought of it nearly paralyzed him with dread, but there was no other option. Behind him, he could hear the soft, deliberate footsteps of the Antlered Man, slowly descending after him. Ethan's pulse raced, his heart hammering in his chest as he took the steps 2 at a time, his legs burning with the effort. Down and down he ran, the sterile walls of the stairwell pressing in on him, each floor a blur as he passed it. His lungs ached, his breath shallow and desperate, but he couldn't stop, not with the thing behind him. The air grew colder, damper, as he descended. The stairwell seemed to stretch on forever, the distance warping as though the building itself was shifting, playing tricks on him. His legs began to shake, the muscles threatening to give out, but the footsteps behind him never faltered. As he reached the lower floors, the smell of rot and decay hit him, thick and foul. The walls of the stairwell were slick with something dark and oily, and the once clean steps were now covered in a thick, viscous sludge. His shoes slipped, his balance faltering, but he caught himself on the railing, gasping for breath. Finally, he reached the ground floor. Bursting through the door, he stumbled into the streets of the twisted city. The nightmare landscape that had filled his view from above was now all around him. The warped buildings loomed overhead, their jagged edges cutting into the sky like teeth. The streets were narrow and winding, the pavement cracked and uneven. The creatures, those terrible, unnatural things, moved through the city, their grotesque forms barely visible in the flickering light of the sickly sky. A monstrous form slithered past him, its body coiling and uncoiling like a snake. Its skin was translucent, revealing the dark mass of organs and tendrils beneath. Eyes, hundreds of them, blinked along its length, each one turning to stare at Ethan as it passed, a low, rumbling hiss escaping its maw. He ducked into an alley, his breath catching in his throat as he pressed himself against the cold, wet wall. The sounds of the creatures, growling, snarling, feeding, filled the air, mingling with the distant sound of dripping water and the constant thrum of the twisted city. The footsteps were still behind him, slow, deliberate. The Antlered Man was hunting him. Desperate, Ethan scanned the alley and spotted a manhole cover half buried in debris. With trembling hands, he pried it open and descended into the dark sewers below, the foul stench of rot and decay enveloping him. The tunnels were a labyrinth of filth and shadow, the walls slick with muck. The water that pooled beneath his feet was thick, dark, and reeked of things long dead, but it was better than facing what waited for him above. Or so he thought. As he waded through the murky water, Ethan heard something wet, slithering in the dark. He froze, his breath shallow, listening. Then he saw them. Blob-like creatures, formless and grotesque, oozed along the tunnel walls. Their bodies were translucent, revealing the writhing mass of tendrils and organs beneath the surface. Eyes, too many eyes, blinked open along their fleshy surfaces, fixing on Ethan with an unnerving intelligence. They pulsated and quivered as they moved toward him, their bodies leaving a trail of slime in their wake. Ethan's breath hitched as the blob creatures oozed closer, their multitude of eyes blinking in unison, locking onto him with an eerie sense of purpose. Their gelatinous forms quivered, the surface rippling as if something alive was trying to break free from beneath their translucent skin. He could hear their labored breaths, a wet, sucking noise that echoed through the sewer tunnel, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. He stumbled backward, splashing through the rancid water, trying to keep his balance on the slick, uneven ground. Panic surged in his chest. He turned and ran deeper into the labyrinthine sewer system, the cold, wet air stinging his lungs. The tunnels twisted and turned in impossible ways, each passage looking identical to the last, the oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides. Every step felt like it led him deeper into a place where the laws of reality no longer held sway. Behind him, the creatures followed, their slow, undulating movements filling the tunnel with a sickening squelch. They were relentless, moving as a grotesque tide of flesh and eyes, their tendrils stretching toward him, feeling their way through the dark. The tunnel's narrow walls closed in on him as he ran, his footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. But no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't shake the sensation that something far worse was just behind him. His foot caught on something, and he crashed to the ground, the fetid water splashing up around him. He gasped, his hands scraping across the slimy surface of the tunnel floor as he scrambled to his feet. His mind screamed for him to keep going, to not look back, but he couldn't resist. He turned, just for a second, just to see if they were closer. The nearest blob had stretched out, its tendrils curling and writhing, reaching for him. It pulsated with unnatural life, its surface shifting and shimmering with grotesque colors as it moved. Ethan's stomach churned as he caught sight of something within it. Faces, human faces, distorted and stretched, pressed against the membrane of the creature's body. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their eyes wide with terror, trapped within the creature's pulsing mass. Ethan recoiled in horror, turning and running blindly through the maze of tunnels. His pulse hammered in his ears, each beat reverberating like a countdown to something inevitable, something inescapable. He wasn't just lost in the sewer anymore. He was descending deeper into something far worse. The walls around him seemed to stretch and warp, the tunnels growing narrower, the ceiling pressing down as though the city itself was trying to consume him. The air grew colder, the oppressive stench more unbearable with each step. He had no idea how long he had been running when he came upon the antechamber. It was large, impossibly so, far too vast for a space beneath the city. The walls were made of slick, black stone, carved with intricate, angular symbols that hurt to look at. The air hummed with energy, thick with something ancient and powerful, and at the center of the room stood an obelisk, tall, black, and gleaming with an unnatural sheen. It seemed to pulse faintly with light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered toward the obelisk, his eyes fixed on its strange, hypnotic surface. There was something wrong with the room, something deeply, fundamentally wrong, but it was too late to turn back now. The things chasing him, the twisted labyrinth he had descended into, none of it made sense anymore. As he approached the obelisk, a low, deep hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet, through his bones, through his very soul. It was like the sound of the universe breathing, something primal and infinite. Then, the footsteps returned. Ethan's blood ran cold. Slowly he turned, knowing what he would see before he even looked. The Antlered Man was there, standing in the entrance to the chamber, his glowing white eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that was both unnerving and magnetic. He stood motionless, tall and gaunt, his antlers curling into the shadows above like the gnarled branches of a dying tree. There was something deeply ancient about him, something far older than the world Ethan knew. "You've come far," the Antlered Man said, his voice a low, resonant echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the voice of something that had seen the birth of stars, something that had watched empires rise and fall, and yet had remained unchanged. Ethan's mouth was dry, his mind reeling. What are you?" he managed to choke out. The figure tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. "I am what has always been and what will always be," he replied. "I am the truth that lies behind the veil of your reality, and you Ethan Cole, are here to learn that truth. Ethan took a step back, shaking his head. I don't understand. Why me? What is this place? What's happening? The antlered man smiled, a slow, terrible smile that didn't reach his eyes. You have seen it, haven't you? The creatures, the city that was once yours. The truth is not in the world you knew, Ethan. The truth is here, in the consummation of all things. Life, as you understand it, is but one fragment of the greater whole. In our world or yours, all sentient beings derive from the same source, the consumption of everything. Ethan's mind struggled to process the words. Consumption, he repeated, his voice trembling. The man nodded slowly, his antlers casting long shadows across the chamber. To consume is to exist, to devour is to become. Everything in the universe, every star, every soul, every fragment of existence is part of the cycle. You have seen the creatures, haven't you? They feed, as they must. It is their purpose, as it is yours. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. No, I won't be part of this. I can't. The antlered man stepped closer, his eyes glowing brighter, almost blinding in their intensity. You cannot escape it. The only way out is through meaning, and the only meaning in this universe is consumption. Ethan stumbled back, his body trembling with fear. But there was nowhere left to run. No escape from the truth that stood before him. The creatures in the sewers, the twisted city above, they were part of the same cycle, part of the same endless hunger that now closed in on him. I won't let you take me, Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the antlered man. The figure's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling light. Oh, but you will, Ethan. You already have. And then, before Ethan could move, the man lunged forward. Ethan's scream echoed through the chamber as the antlered man's mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, gleaming teeth. His long, spindly arms wrapped around Ethan, pulling him in as his jaws closed over him. But instead of the searing pain of being torn apart, Ethan felt something else, a merging, a becoming. The darkness closed in around him, but he was still aware, still conscious. He could feel the antlered man's mind, his thoughts, his ancient hunger. He was becoming. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness consumed him was the chamber, the obelisk pulsing with that strange, eerie light, and the twisted grin of the man with the antlers. Then there was nothing but hunger. The city twisted and writhed under the darkened sky, its streets crawling with abominations, and in the shadows, the antlered man moved silently, his white eyes gleaming in the gloom as he watched a new figure stumbling through the ruined streets, another soul lost in the nightmare. He smiled. The hunt had begun again.